This is a story about the coronavirus pandemic, as told through the lens of an ordinary high school student who experienced its spread from ground zero in China. This story is not yet finished, but in the midst of the darkness, there is still hope. As a junior in high school, my life is filled with homework, exams, and participating in my various extracurricular hobbies. News about the coronavirus is like a gunshot, waking me up and breaking my rose-colored glasses. My imaginary peace ended, and the battle has begun. The start of the coronavirus in China largely went unnoticed. According to South China Morning Post, the first documented coronavirus case was on November 17, 2019, in Hubei, China. The victim was a 55-year-old male, but the first cases of coronavirus were largely suppressed from mainstream news. In fact, the government went even so far to discredit Li Wenliang, who was the first Chinese whistleblower doctor who tried to warn the public. The first coronavirus case documented in Jiangsu, which is the province in China where I live, was on January 22, 2020. The next day, on January 23rd, my mom asked me to wear a face mask and to commute to school by car instead of the metro. As I watched Nanjing through the car window, I saw how the city continued bustling as usual. Crowds of people were rushing about on the street, most of them without a mask. That day at school, I can still recall sitting in the streaming classroom. Out of 30 students, only 2 other students were wearing blue medical masks. The blueness stood out among the crowded yellow faces. When I returned home that day, I saw the breaking news headline, Wuhan City was officially closed. The next day, on the 24th of January, the number of people wearing face masks largely increased. It was Chinese New Year's Eve. Normally, the city is alive with color and commotion, yet this year, as I glimpsed around my classmates preparing for the exams and looked around Nanjing City, everything and everyone looked gray. On January 25th, I was informed that all of the schools and educational institutions in Nanjing were closing. The date at which schools would reopen remained unspecified. So thus began my period of self-quarantine. For the first time in my life, my parents canceled our yearly Chinese New Year trip, where we would go to my hometown of Hai'an and pay our respects to my grandparents. There would be no hugs and kisses from the grandparents, no large family reunion dinners where we'd laugh about family stories and eat until our bellies protruded. The only thing that had a slight taste of Chinese New Year was the fried nuts that my mom carefully placed on a nice large plate. The watermelon seeds, sunflower seeds, walnuts, cornflakes, cashews, and peanuts quietly slept on the round plate, mourning in silence. This Chinese New Year came and went without much reason for cheer or celebration. In fact, the stress of the world crept into our home. The TV was podcasting the Spring Festival Gala, which according to the Guinness World Records has the largest audience of any entertainment show in the world. Normally, the lively variety show with its array of music, dance, comedy, and drama performances would bring lots of laughter, yet this year I can barely recall a single performance. Instead, the Spring Festival Gala played in the background as my family and I spent the entire night swiping our phones and reading about the immense and overwhelming pressure that the medical resources were facing in Wuhan. My mom and I felt obligated to help, so we bought medical supplies and donated them to various hospitals across Wuhan. This was the least we could do. Quarantining indoors didn't upset me too much, but my parents were obviously super worried. My mother checked her phone all day, every day for real-time updates on the number of infected. The coronavirus hit Nanjing very unluckily during the Spring Festival, which is a time where the number of people traveling peaks and is the highest out of anywhere in the world. This likely further propelled the exponential spread of the virus. My mom was also worried about finding places where we could still get food and supplies. Given the vast number of people in China, the dwindling number of supplies available became a scary reality. Oftentimes, demand drastically outpaced supply as most grocery shops, food delivery apps, and other stores were out of food and other supplies. As our world became increasingly isolated, the internet eventually took up 80% of our lives. Oh, the internet, what a double-edged sword, being both a savior and oppressor. On the one hand, the internet was the only way in which we could facilitate normal activities, like taking classes and ordering groceries and supplies. On the other hand, we were chained to our WeChats, obsessively checking for the latest horror story and watching the real-time infection distribution map. Our lives largely came to a standstill, both metaphorically and realistically. On average, I probably took 300 steps a day. Gone were the days where we could order delicious food takeout, smell the trees, and hug a friend. Now, our family's main pastime was watching home exercise videos. As I listened to the soft buzz from our central air system and watched the wild cats wandering outside of my window, I couldn't help but feel sad about this new normal. Despite the boredom, I'm beyond grateful that my family and friends have survived this pandemic with their health intact. I know I am so lucky that the bad news stayed in the news and did not seep into my life. As the situation in Wuhan grew worse, every city in China began dispatching their medical material resources to help Wuhan, but the number of people contracting the virus skyrocketed exponentially, both in and out of Wuhan. On February the 7th, Dr. Li Wenliang, one of the whistleblowers of the outbreak, died of COVID-19 infection. On February 20th, 621 people on the giant cruise ship Diamond Princess were confirmed to have the virus. During the whole pandemic, the number of confirmed cases in Wuhan reached 50,340. During this time, I could do nothing but wait. On February 23rd, our school announced that all of our classes will resume but be taught online. While I understand the importance of safety in this matter, it's hard to ignore the fact that the quality of our lessons was compromised. By spring of 2020, the epidemic seemed to slightly ease up. Patients were being discharged from the makeshift hospitals in Wuhan, the number of COVID-19 infections started to stabilize, and medical resources were no longer as scarce as before. More people were allowed to go outside, and many could be seen walking on the streets. After 23 days of isolation, I went outside for the first time since the total shutdown. That first outing was a literal breath of fresh air. As my mom, dad, and I walked by the main city wall in our masks, I saw peach blossoms and plum blossoms smiling up at me, and the petals scattered across the grass. Looking upward at the sun, I felt its warmth shine down on me, and I wanted to capture this happiness in a bottle and carry it with me. But the impact of the virus still pervaded. On March the 17th, I received an email from the College Board informing me that the international SAT test that I signed up for in March would be cancelled. A few days later, I got another email that the May SAT was also cancelled. After more than 2 months of intense preparation, I felt like my hard work was going to waste. In addition to the SAT, most other exams like the Chinese Gaokao, TOEFL, IELTS, Euclid Math competition, so on and so on, they were all either cancelled or postponed. While the learning environment had been disrupted, it's really not as important in the grand scheme of things. After all, it seems childish to complain about online learning when there are millions of healthcare workers fighting against the infection at the front line, families struggling with basic income needs, and patients struggling with the illness. In April, as the pandemic in Jiangsu stabilized, the Nanjing government notified schools to reopen. I went back to school on April the 13th. It is worth mentioning that the Nanjing government has implemented strict protective measures to help reduce the risk of virus transfer. For example, they've implemented temperature measurement systems where people are tested with contactless thermometers. Furthermore, people are required to wear face masks at all times. There are thousands of tissue dispensing stations across the city so people can get a tissue to call the elevator, open doors, and so on. The Nanjing government also requires foreigners and out-of-province travelers to register whenever they come to Nanjing, with the goal of tracking possible COVID-19 patients in the future. On the first day back to school, my school gave everyone a stack of extremely comprehensive health forms to complete. The health form required us to detail out everything from our daily body temperature to each family member's health situation.
为确保学校在发现疫情时能够熟练启动应急处理程序，南京多所中学
Our school itself looked like a high-security government building now. Guarding the front entrance of our school were 4 tents, each housing large infrared thermometer systems. When students arrive at school, we are required to get in line and have our temperature measured by the school doctor before proceeding inside. In class, everyone is required to wear a face mask for the entire day. In the cafeteria, 2 plastic partitions were erected to divide the table into 4 grids. As a new school policy, students are not allowed to stay at school past 3:30 p.m., which effectively forced many clubs to cancel their activities. Life was certainly a lot less fun, but I'm counting my blessings, since at least I was able to attend school. On April the 13th, the school finally opened. 3 days after the school opened, we had our first midterm exam. Since the school's lockdown caused a huge delay in our scheduled teachings, a lot of the course material that was supposed to be taught in the first semester got pushed to the second semester. As a result, the second semester was super busy. But the good thing was that by the summer of 2020, Nanjing has recovered most of its vitality. More stores were reopening and the general atmosphere became less frightful. Nevertheless, the effects of COVID still lingered. People were still required to wear masks in public and fill out health forms at work and at school. Social distancing still pervaded as people awkwardly shuffle past each other on the streets and chat through plastic barriers in dining halls. This virus has inflicted so much destruction and tragedy, yet in the depths of the darkness, so many heroes have emerged wearing the unlikeliest of capes. From the nurses who risked their own lives to treat patients, to the sanitation workers who kept our city clean, to the delivery people who brought us essential supplies, to the millions of normal people who risked their own lives to help a stranger. Thank you. Thank you for your kindness and compassion. Thank you for showing us the depths of a human's capability to do good. And here is an interview with 2 graduates from my school.
I booked 3 plane tickets altogether. My route back home was to fly from San Francisco to Taipei and then transfer to Xiamen and finally back to Nanjing. My parents were worried, so they sent me a big package of epidemic prevention tools, not to mention some faceless masks. The package also included goggles, protective clothing, gloves, and shoe covers. The strongest impression I had on my way back home was a sense of relief because although it took me about 30 hours to travel from the airport to the hotel for quarantine, it didn't stress me out. On the contrary, I think my return to China was quite smooth. From the nucleic acid testing when I first entered Xiamen to the transfer to another terminal station, the whole process was very organized. The staff was also extremely patient. During my quarantine time, all the passengers staying in the hotel were in a WeChat group. Each morning and night, everyone had their temperature measured and reported the data to the group chat. I was tested the day after I checked in and the penultimate day after I left the hotel. During the isolation period, meals were packed meals, which were delivered to the door of my room at the appointed time. After I finished eating, I would put the mailbox at the door and the staff would take it away.
I returned to China on May the 21st this year by Sichuan Airlines, and I was quarantined in Chengdu, China. My mom initially bought a plane ticket on March 28th and wanted me to fly back to Shanghai. However, it happened to be on March 28th that China issued a new policy of 5 ones. One air company, one country, one airline, and one flight every 1 week. Just like this, my flight was unfortunately cancelled. Later, my mom bought me 9 plane tickets in total. I took the flight of Sichuan Airlines back to China on May the 21st. I wasn't anxious and worried at all at that time. I didn't buy any protective clothing, and the protective glasses that I wore were the goggles I used in university labs. So I went back to China with a resigned attitude. On the plane, I was on the third seat in the row. The seat next to me was empty, but the seat on the far right, which was also the third seat, was taken. I had bags of vacuum-packed food and bottled water. It was not easy to get on the flight because I had to refresh a health code represented by a plane icon every day before the flight. If I had missed one day, the plane icon would have turned red and I wouldn't have been able to get on the plane. When the plane landed, the crew gave each passenger a yellow sticker. The stickers were marked serious and moderate based on the severity of the situation of areas. The serious ones were usually from the Great Toronto area, while the moderate ones were usually from smaller cities such as Waterloo. The first thing I did when I got off the plane was to have a COVID test. And then I waited for the hotel bus to pick me up. It turned out that the quarantine hotel was pretty cozy to live in, and I enjoyed myself quite well during the 14 days of quarantine.
厕所
The only downside was that we are not allowed to turn on our AC in our hotel because it was central air conditioning that could potentially cause cross-infections. After I arrived at Nanjing, I reported to the community about my landing, and then I did a COVID test again. I was tested once a week for the following 2 weeks. So this is the epitome of my journey of returning back to China since the COVID outbreak in Canada.
This time under the mask has been an unforgettable experience for every Nanjinger. One day, we shall all be able to take off our masks and come out stronger, together. Hopefully, that day is close.